Hi, this is Chris Cunnane, Research Director for Supply Chain Management at ARC Advisory Group. Joining me today for our Logistics Viewpoints Executive Spotlight Series is Pervinder Johar, CEO of Blume Global. Pervinder, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of your show, Chris.
To kick things off, can you give me a little bit about your background and let us know how you got involved with supply chain management?
Definitely. It's been a long time. So it was 20 some years back, age when I stumbled on how do you do logistics optimization with a company called logistics.com. So we had the coolest name at that time. Ended up selling that company to Manhattan Associates. So I stayed with Manhattan as their CTO for a while. So that was my beginning. And then my beginning was looking at LTL to truckload consolidation, and in the truckload and LTL market on how do you do optimization for drivers, for load, and then how the industry works, starting with transportation and moving on to then other areas of supply chain. After Manhattan, ended up going to a large, at that time we were Fortune 9 high-tech company. Looking at global supply chain strategy and systems. So that was all aspects of supply chain, from planning to execution, from order to cash, to procure to pay, manufacturing, logistics, anything you can think of, Chris. So it's been a long time now in all areas of supply chain.
Well, it certainly sounds like it. Now, for those unfamiliar with Blume Global, can you give me a little bit about the company and what you do?
Sure. So we launched Blume Global in 2018. So people wouldn't have known us before 18, because even the name happened in 2018. Do we have a long history, because there were two companies that became part of Blume at that time. Our focus is on a digital supply chain platform for both end-to-end visibility as well as orchestration. And when I say orchestration, it is that how do companies execute their supply chain processes from end-to-end perspective. If I step back a little bit, Chris, what we saw in 18 had been doing logistics and supply chain for, as I mentioned, a couple of decades. One of the areas which was a white space or an open area, that international supply chains and intermodal supply chains, how do we manage that ecosystem? So we launched Blume to initially focus on international and intermodal, and then we evolved into looking at all aspects of supply chain. But the company is headquartered here in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco Bay Area, offices around the globe now, and then customers from all segments of supply chain.
The last 18 plus months have been challenging for global supply chains, but we've seen supply chain solutions have weathered the storm better than other industries. What can you say about the state of global supply chains as well as supply chain technology?
Sure. So for one part, the supply chain has become a household name, even though COVID has been really bad from the human aspect perspective. But it has put the focus back on how our global supply chains are configured and how do we manage disruptions in the supply chain. Maybe I will break it up into a couple of different parts. Right? So if you think of first half of 2020, everyone had a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know what the demand was going to look like. So if you're running a supply chain, the demand for essential goods had spiked, but we didn't know what the rest of the demand was going to look like. So many of these supply chains fell into these two categories. If you're in essential goods, how do you get them available? A lot of e-commerce happened at that time, right? Because the stores were, even though if they were open, people started buying a lot more on an e-commerce side. And we went through a phase where people actually contracted on what they were going to do from just a capacity perspective. And then we saw second half of 2020 where the demand again spiked, Our GDP numbers have been amazing. Kind of, if you think of this year now that it went up by 7.7%. So all of a sudden, kind of there was a shift of the demand because people couldn't really spend it on travel, couldn't spend it on going out and eating, couldn't really spend on hotels, and all of it getting discretionary spend meant that the demand spiked. And we saw that many of the supply chains kind of had issues in reacting to this capacity issue. Right? Not all companies did well in weathering this storm. Right? So it was almost a wake-up call for many of the companies which were not digital to begin with. And Chris, I still remember kind of there were companies where they had employees were all coming to office and they had not even given them kind of laptops to be able to work from home. Right? So we had one category of companies where there were supply chains were fairly digital, employees could work from anywhere. And there were other supply chains where we were dealing with that. How do you even get people to work from home? Right? And then you saw the result was that demand for PCs and laptops went through the roof at that time. Where we sit today, though, if you think of 2021, we still have issues on international ocean shipping. We have issues on the air. Both sides, the capacity has gone down. Right? So supply chains are trying to deal with kind of how do I go do with international movements. And then there are kind of several other issues that we are facing today. But as you said, though, all in all, we did fairly well, but we still have a lot more work to do and a lot more kind of changes to make as we look to the future.
Are there other trends in the market that you are seeing or that your customers are talking about?
Yeah, so I think the mega trend is still that the focus is more on inbound supply chains than outbound. But what we saw that our outbound supply chains, including the last mile delivery, the technology was there, companies were well equipped kind of to go manage it. But on the inbound side is where kind of where everyone is seeing issues. And they're broken up into two types of issues, Chris, right? One is take semiconductors as an example. There's a shortage of semiconductor capacity around the world. So many of the factories are not really able to run because there just is a component shortage, right? And it's impacting not only high tech, but who knew that our automotive market is so dependent on semiconductors. So that component shortage kind of is showing up for us. And the second, as I mentioned, is just the transportation capacity. How do you go and move the goods? Kind of as you think of even last week, we had 70 vessels which were waiting to dock at Port of LA. That's a lot of container, a lot of inventories, which is just sitting in the water, and we are not able to process that through. But all of them, I will take it back to that they're all inbound supply chain issues that we are dealing with today.
Well, one thing that we've seen is that supply chain technology has been improving at a rapid rate.
Yeah.
What do you see as the next stage of supply chain technology evolution?
So if I step back on the supply chain itself, right? So we have been talking about digitization of supply chain, and that's a trend which is here to stay. And we are still not fully digital. Reason for that is kind of, if you think of supply chain broadly, about 90% of the businesses involved in supply chain are small to medium enterprises. Take US as an example. And so in US, if I focus on containerized moves, there are about 6,900 motor carriers in US. Only 7 of them have more than 100 million in revenue. And I'm not talking about the large truckload guys. I'm talking about people who move the containers, either ocean containers or the domestic containers, which requires a chassis to move. Those companies, there are not that many which are large, right? So when we talk about technology-wise, and this has been a focus of Blume Global, that how do you make sure that every participant in the supply chain is digital, not just that the larger companies are digital. I've also talked about it before too, that the word itself, right? We have been calling supply chain a chain, but the reality is that it's a network, right? And then it's a network, and you have to have every aspect of the network digital for us to really become digital. From advances perspective on technology itself, the artificial intelligence and machine learning is helping with automation. And Chris, the other mega trend which is there is such a severe labor shortage everywhere. So you've probably seen all the news stories about the great resignation. And so this year, how many of the people are switching jobs? But the reality is that there are just not enough people available to work in the warehouse. It's not only a driver shortage anymore, it's a shortage of labor all across. From technology perspective, when you think of artificial intelligence and machine learning, a lot of the focus is on automation itself. Right? So my view is that we will continue to see kind of this evolution of what I've been calling the rise of the platforms with supported network, which are digital platforms to begin with, but then a lot more cognitive abilities so that you can do automation and then see how do we keep our supply chains running without it being heavily dependent on the labor that is in short supply today, in addition to kind of the capacity on the either the chip side or capacity on the ocean or air cargo side. We also have a shortage of the people today.
Well, as you mentioned, the network effect is, clearly another hot topic right now in supply chain management. What benefits do you see from a networked platform rather than a series of individual applications?
Sure. And I think focus has been on that the consumer side has already moved to the network platform. Right? If you think of DoorDash is a network platform which connects kind of restaurants with the consumers. Right? So they don't own any restaurants, they don't have any assets, they don't have any drivers, but however, it's a platform which is a network platform which allows you and I to buy from any restaurant without worrying about whether that restaurant has kind of their own drivers or not. We are seeing the same thing on the supply chain side, on the business side, that you need to focus on kind of a network which connects all type of players. And because if you break down the supply chain, there are, of course, you have retailers and CPG companies and suppliers, kind of, which is one way of looking at supply chain. But then there is also logistics providers. There are freight forwarders, 3PLs, trucking companies, ocean carriers, air cargo providers, terminals. They're all participants on a network. So when we talk about a network platform, it really is talking about that how many different types of participants are on it, and for you to be able to go execute an application, or how many of them are on the platform too. On the application side, for 20 some years, we've been thinking about the silos of planning. If you go back to the old PRTM model, it was plan, source, make, deliver. So we had divided up kind of our view of the supply chain into 4 segments to begin with about 30 years back. And we have continued to propagate kind of that silos. But the reality is that these silos need to work with each other. And technology is no different, because all of the companies said, okay, planning is a segment, I'm going to go make planning applications. Or deliver is a segment, I will do order management or transportation or warehousing in it. Procurement is a segment, I will do procurement applications. But for a supply chain to run effectively, all of these applications have to work with each other. Right? And when you think of a platform which allows you to orchestrate these 4 areas together, that's the new trend. And I think that's the new trend which is here to stay. And then as we say here at Blume Global, that we're building a platform for the next 50 years. Because it's not about kind of 1 year, 2 years. It's just a fundamental shift that has happened kind of from applications to networked platforms.
Another topic that I've heard a lot about lately, especially if you talk about sort of the digital transformation of supply chains, is really around digital twins. Is a digital twin just a model of the supply chain, or is there more to it?
It's just so there. If you think of a digital twin of the supply chain, it is trying to understand how our supply chains work. See, many people talk about digital twin of their supply chain, and there might be any one kind of company, right? They will think of either their customer locations, their distribution centers, their manufacturing locations, etc. Okay? But that's not really kind of a model of their supply chain because there are so many intermediate points as well. Right? Take an example of a manufacturer who is manufacturing in Asia and has customers in US. Right? So when they talk about a twin, they might think of that, okay, I need to know what my locations are in Asia, what my distribution centers are in US, who are my customers, where are their distribution centers. But underlying all of that, Chris, is also this notion of where are all the ocean terminals in the world? Where are all the rail ramps in the world? How do things move kind of through it? And it's not about modeling kind of in static form for a digital twin. It's knowing in real time what's actually going on at any one of kind of these nodes. So it's not a static model. It's a real life simulation of that. How is the supply chain performing? Right? So if I stay with the example of kind of Port of LA, Long Beach, the model needs to show not only that what are the terminals, but you also need to show that right now there are 70 vessels which are waiting to be docked, which is the real-time information that you have to include. And for a single shipper, their containers are not necessarily going to be on every one of those 70 ships, right? It might be only one of those ships, but they still need to know from supply chain model that there are 70 of them, because the other 69 are going to go impact when their vessel is going to dock. Hope that helps. It's not really the static model. It's kind of the real-time nature of knowing how is the supply chain running. And then it's not only about one particular shipper supply chain. It's the word supply chain. Kind of if you think of LA as an example, you need to know holistically what's going on with the supply chain to be able to have a real digital twin.
Shifting gears a little bit, the last topic that I want to touch upon is supply chain sustainability. We've seen a lot of interest in this lately, and it really comes in a variety of forms, from responsible product packaging and energy efficiency to alternative fuels, and really down to route optimization for trucks. What are the key things you are seeing in terms of supply chain sustainability, and what is Blume Global doing to make a difference?
Sure. I think for us, it's been for me, it's been a personal kind of mission to some extent, but even for the company as a whole, when we founded Blume, we had set 3 different goals for us. First one was that how do you take about $1 trillion of spend out of global supply chains by using a network platform versus kind of siloed approach that people have had. Right after that was our environmental goal, that how do we help kind of make world supply chains more sustainable. And our third part is focused on how do you democratize technology for these smaller businesses, but I will talk more about sustainability first. So first of all, as Blume Global, we were the first technology company which became carbon neutral. Right? So we wanted to understand ourselves and what is the company's carbon footprint and how do we offset it. So earlier this year, kind of it was a process. I mean, it took us close to a year to figure out kind of what is our carbon footprint and how do we go and kind of neutralize it. But when you look at supply chains as a whole, many of the supply chains today have trouble even understanding what their carbon footprint is. And as you mentioned, it comes in many different forms. Right? So one of the ones, which is the big sustainability initiative that has been around, is that how do you take air out? And I do mean air kind of from the packaging perspective, right? So how do you go make the smaller packages kind of the air is a big reason on kind of why things are bulky. So you're back to kind of that, how you're not transporting kind of more air. So you get into the packaging side of it too. But that's not what Blume's focus is. Our focus is more on the transportation side of it. And on the transportation side, people have typically made decisions only on the basis of either speed or cost. So we always talk about that, do I use an express service or not? Kind of. So if you think of the 2 parameters, Chris, we have always looked at is the speed and the cost. What we do from Blume perspective, that we insert another parameter, which is that what's the carbon footprint that you're going to be using, and how do we help make an organization make their decisions not only on speed, not only on cost, but also on the environmental costs, that may be associated with it. And you will be surprised how many companies kind of just don't know that, right? So even a simple thing that if I'm doing even an ocean move, what's the cost if I'm going to use a vessel which takes 21 days to get from Asia to US, or something that takes 10 days? It comes with an environmental cost. And how do we go figure out that cost? It is not that easy. And kind of from a platform like ours, that is one of our focus areas.
Well, Pervinder, I want to thank you for joining me today on the Logistics Viewpoints Executive Spotlight and really sharing some great insights. So again, thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you, Chris.
My guest today was Pervinder Johar, CEO of Blume Global. Thank you for watching.